After 4 weeks in the SBF trial, it has all come down to this: the closing arguments and verdict in Sam Bankman-Fried's criminal trial, facing 7 charges. And we have finally gotten to the closing arguments and very soon the jury deliberations. It was a back and forth. We've been covering this one for weeks, but a pretty spicy ending when you had Nicholas Rose, the assistant U.S. attorney here, providing the closing arguments for the government, going back and forth, and then Sam's lawyer, Mark Cohen, who hasn't exactly been the greatest defense attorney throughout this whole thing, closed as well. And it was, I suppose, at least convincing enough to maybe have the jury ask themselves whether all of this leads to 7 convictions for Sam Bankman-Fried. And just want to recap what we heard in the courtroom, since I've been going there to cover all of this for Coinage, and recap what we heard from Nicholas Rose, because the big questions are whether Sam knew what was going on throughout this whole alleged scheme, and whether or not there was actually criminal intent. And that is going to be the biggest piece of this, and you heard it in the closing arguments that, again, came from a man who is very adept at convicting crypto criminals. He, of course, already threw in jail OpenSea's Nate Chastain, who, interestingly, actually is going to jail on the same day that potentially we could see the verdict come through. But he hit the jury with 3 main questions that he walked through, and it was very systematic over about 3 hours. The prosecution mainly asking 3 questions. 1, where did the money go? What happened? And who was responsible? And, of course, the prosecution kicked it off pretty spicy. It was something like out of a movie. He pointed at Sam Bankman-Fried and said, "This man, the defendant, is responsible. Sam Bankman-Fried," and set the tone basically for what we were going to hear throughout, and walked through reason after reason why A, this was fraud, and B, why the jury should find him guilty again and again and again. And it all kind of boils down to, as the last few weeks have played out, as our coverage has highlighted, kind of boils down to, what did Sam know about using customer funds? Did he violate the terms of service? Did he know each time he did so that it was wrong? And you basically had the prosecution boiling it down and making it very simple. And I got to give them a lot of credit, because they used a lot of real-life experiences, whether it's spending money on a credit card or whether it's applying for a mortgage. They used examples that pretty much everyone is familiar with. And if you remember from our series with Mark Litt, Bernie Madoff's sworn prosecutor, looking at this stuff, the key for the prosecution was going to make this extremely simple, not get into the weeds with margin trading, with what crypto is, with staking, with all the complexities. They boiled it down to a very simple case, and we heard that from the prosecution in the closing argument, saying this is not about cryptocurrency, it's about deception, it's about stealing, it's about greed. Now, if I had to knock maybe the defense on one point here, is they opened up the closing arguments by talking about all the victims, which basically went back to a year ago when the collapse was happening in November, saying a bunch of FTX's customers were trying mightily to get their money off exchanges. And Nicholas Rose was basically going back to, think about the dread turning into despair for FTX customers, thinking about the millions of dollars stuck on the platform, later billions, and all of the dread inside the heads, the anxiety, as customers were trying to get money off the platform and could not withdraw. Now, you would think they would be able to find more sympathetic victims in this quote-unquote fraud, but who they put up there on the stand, they opened this whole trial with a French commodities trader who lives in London, who trades cocoa beans. Not exactly, similar kind of to the Bernie Madoff scheme when you think about teachers, old people, retirees who are counting on this money to basically survive the rest of their lives. They went with a French commodities trader, which, if there are points to be docked here, that might be one, especially if it's so important that you're opening your closing arguments with the victims. And I thought back to it, and I'm like, wait a minute, they never really had a really strong victim, but nonetheless, we'll put that to the side. As Mark Litt also predicted, as we highlighted, another piece of this was closing off any kind of wiggle room that the jury might hear from the defense's closing argument, which we'll get to in a second, was basically saying, look, to believe the defendant, to believe SBF that none of this was fraud, that none of this was criminal, you'd have to ignore all the evidence we've just shown you over the last few weeks. You'd have to ignore the evidence of customer funds being put into Alameda Research bank accounts and that money flowing through to Alameda Research and venture investments that Sam directed, you'd have to ignore all of that. And, as we covered, leaving no room for the idiot defense here, you heard the prosecution say you would have to believe the defendant, who graduated from MIT, again, very smart guy, who ran two $2 billion companies and who was testifying before Congress. You'd have to believe that Sam Bankman-Fried was actually clueless, and he had no idea what was happening at his own company and had no idea what he was doing was wrong. And that, again, closes off the idea of this, oh, I didn't know. And as the prosecution has spent the majority of their time, and did so, I think, extremely well, pointed out exactly what Sam knew along the way. And that was basically done by using his three top lieutenants, Caroline Ellison, his co-founder Gary Wong, and Nishad Singh, his head of, basically his chief development guy, all saying that this was bad. They knew it was bad, and took the stand to tell them exactly why. And that led the prosecution to basically instill in the jury this idea of, we're going to highlight 6 times where SBF knew exactly what he was doing and proceeded to choose the wrong path, the criminal path. Each time that he could have basically said, all right, I'm in over my skis, and back out and try and do best for customers. Instead, he doubled down and tried to dig the hole deeper. Now, the defense will say, that's not criminal intent. Each way through, he was trying to still, he realized it was a bad decision, that they made mistakes along the way, that nothing's ever perfect, no one's ever perfect. And the defense basically throughout has always said, sure, was he a perfect CEO? No. Was this criminal, though, in the way that he always wanted to steal customer funds and always steal money? No. He tried his best all the way up until the end when he was still trying to raise money from investors to plug the hole that eventually happened, not criminally so, but because mistakes were made, miscalculations were made, that he was still trying up until the very end. Now, if you believe the prosecution, these 6 points, I think, were pretty strong. One, he highlighted, Nicholas Rose did in his closing arguments, the idea that FTX spent $2 billion, a little bit over, on buying back Binance's stake in FTX. And of course, as we all know, that did in fact open the door for CZ to dump his FTT tokens and create or spark, if you will, this cascading event of FTT collapsing, and we all know how that played out in November of 2022. The point that the prosecution's making, though, is at the same time, you had Caroline Ellison basically telling Sam, we don't have enough money to do this. We don't have enough money. We're not making enough money to use billions of dollars to buy out Binance's stake. And nonetheless, Sam responds with, this is important. We should do it. And so you have the prosecution setting up this idea of, look, this is a smart guy, SBF. He knows you need money to spend money. And if you're already seeing potentially a problem on the horizon, why are you spending this money? Why are you using FTX deposits to buy out the stake of your largest competitor? Maybe because you don't care about what happens to customers, and maybe you're putting your own personal needs, wanting to cut your rival out from owning you ahead of what potentially could happen later on. So that was a point that they made. I think it was a pretty good point to make. And they went on to highlight that, again, warnings from Caroline Ellison that this potentially could happen, that they might be spending too much money and could potentially face a disaster scenario if they continue spending the way that they are. The prosecution basically said, well, knowing the financial picture isn't good, he continued to spend anyway. In fact, the quote was, he goes on a spending spree that would rival someone who had just won the lottery, except he had not, obviously, won the lottery. He had stolen billions of dollars. So again, using these real world examples to show that he's continuing to spend money when maybe he shouldn't be, and that's criminal and that's fraud. But the best fraud example, I think, came in about the 4th of 6 examples that the prosecution got to, which was, of course, perhaps the most damning if you think about just simple fraud, which was Caroline Ellison creating 8 balance sheets for Alameda that they sent to investors. And she alleges, as she said on the stand, Sam chose one of those alternative tabs and said, basically okayed it to go out to investors that hid exactly how much money they were borrowing from FTX, which is mostly customer funds, and hid personal loans that were made to FTX and Alameda executives like Sam and Nishad and Gary to basically make their balance sheet look a little bit better. And that was the point that the prosecution really hammered home is, look, you cannot look at that and say that that's not fraud. If you make multiple external balance sheets that you send to your lenders, that's fraud, is what Nicholas Rose is saying to the jury. And if you have two balance sheets and they're totally different, then you clearly have one too many balance sheets, which I thought was a pretty funny way to deliver it. And if you prepare 7 alternative balance sheets and you're like, let's go with the one that's definitely the best one that covers up how we stole $10 billion, that's definitely fraud, and you know that from common sense. So that was a pretty simple way, I think, of explaining potentially this is fraud and hammering home the point that the jury should convict Sam Bankman-Fried. And he also used this simple example, as I said, of a mortgage application. Of, you wouldn't necessarily create 7 different mortgage applications if you're a normal person and go into a bank and say, look, I'm going to give you the one that maybe hides my past financial indiscretions here, which I don't know how strong that is. Maybe sometimes people flex a little bit on mortgage applications or even a job application. Some truth is stretched. So I don't know exactly about that example, but he also provided another one, which was maybe Sam Bankman-Fried going out and buying a very expensive car when he knows potentially the economy could take a dip and he could lose his job. Since crypto was already in trouble in the summer of last year, why he would be spending all this. He said in everyday terms, it's like, what would happen if I brought a brand new sports car that's really expensive, and at the same time, the economy got really bad, and at the same time, I also lost my job. So again, to this recklessness of spending, which I think are pretty good examples. The rest of them, he closes up by saying, look, you should convict Sam Bankman-Fried. This is fraud, and it's very clear. So I think actually pretty well done by the prosecution, again, by a very apt prosecutor in Nicholas Rose. And then you turn things over to the defense, which has not exactly throughout this trial been the strongest. And I say that because as we've covered at Coinage, there were very specific things they had to do. They had to undermine the testimony of Caroline Ellison, Gary Wong, and Nishad Singh, SBF's lieutenants, which again, easier said than done, but basically were unable to do so. They also, as we covered again, they were supposed to make this complex. They were supposed to throw in all this jargon to make the jury think, all right, maybe this isn't just simple fraud. And they did not do that either, I think, during the prosecution or during the testimonies that we saw from everybody. And then the last one, they had to show a lack of criminal intent. And that was essentially the main points that were highlighted in the defense's closing arguments. You had Mark Cohen, who again might not be the best defense attorney in all of this. You had him open his closing arguments with the idea of the government trying to push this false premise that their witnesses themselves had rejected. That from the very beginning, from the jump, FTX was a fraudulent enterprise established by Sam and Gary. And this is very true. And I think it's interesting when you think about the plea deals that Gary and Nishad and Caroline have all already taken with the government to basically help convict Sam, right? They're trying to be as helpful as possible because they don't want super long prison sentences. And that was a point the defense made is, look, no one had any issues with this quote-unquote criminal enterprise if they really are all in this big conspiracy until it was the end. Until it was, hey, I either go to jail for a really long time or I cut a deal and help the government take down Sam. They were there making millions and becoming billionaires at FTX. And so that was a point that they made. And the defense also stressed that, look, this was never a scheme from the very beginning to intentionally steal customer funds. It was a business that made a lot of money and was very successful and was able to raise money to a multi-billion-dollar valuation. I think at the peak, something along $40 billion. And that wouldn't have been true if it weren't a good business. Of course, you could say maybe some of those things, like the balance sheet, maybe made people believe it was a very good business. But nonetheless, the defense pushed the idea that this was not a fraudulent scheme from the very beginning, and that's not what the evidence showed here, trying to create questions that the jury will have to deliberate around criminal intent. At what point did it go wrong? At what point did Sam start making mistakes that, yes, did not pan out to be the right choices in those moments, but the defense says that's not criminal. It's just bad business decisions. Now, I don't know whether or not the jury is going to believe that because the defense didn't really hit that home as much, I don't think. Of course, they said, question whether Sam's business judgment was reasonable. Even if later it turned out to be mistaken, it's not a criminal one. And they painted this idea and used what Nicholas Rose said in his closing arguments by pointing at Sam Bankman-Fried and saying, that man's responsible. Mark Cohen, Sam's lawyer, basically said it's like something out of a movie. The government wants you to believe that Sam is the villain in this movie they're playing for you, that he is basically a caricature of a super bad guy, that he's a criminal from the onset, that he is pure evil, essentially, and pointed out that, like, Nicholas Rose pointing at Sam Bankman-Fried to start is like something out of a movie, and real life is not a movie. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Sometimes those decisions get messy, and that's basically what the defense really spent, I think, the 2 hours or so that they were closing up their argument on. They said, look, we'll agree that there was a time when Sam was probably the worst dressed CEO in the world and had the worst haircut, trying to endear the jury to Sam, I think. And we'll agree that the evidence in this case showed that Sam would talk to just about anyone. TV reporter, journalist, blogger, you name it. And of course, the defense had to defend against a lot of things that I think Sam wished he could take back. But their whole premise there being that if you were organizing a huge criminal scheme, why would you go on national television? Why would you take all these interviews and try and say, look, I'm answering all the questions? That's not what a criminal would do. And I don't know if that's going to land on the jury or not, but it was what the defense was trying to do. And they also went on to say, look, all of these decisions, all of these things, all of these problems when crypto was collapsing in 2022 and you had a bunch of customers rushing and tripping over themselves to take money out, who could have predicted that would happen? Who could have predicted that CZ would tweet that he wants to dump all of this stuff, propping up FTX and Alameda, all of the FTT tokens? He said that made his life messy and made things messy as well, but that's not a crime. The reason we focused, the reason the government focused much of its case on Sam's appearance is that every movie needs a villain. And I don't know how strong that selling point is going to be. Then again, who knows whether or not anything the defense tried to do really hit home when it comes to trying to show Sam's softer side, given the fact that he was nice on direct examination against, questions from his own defense attorney. But then when it turned to the prosecution on cross-examination, he basically stiffened up, got visibly, annoyed by a lot of the questions. And I think the jury might be able to see, all right, maybe there are two Sams here, the one that's trying to say, oh, I wish I could go back and do all this over again, and the one that's a bit hardened when he's being pelted by question after question by the prosecution saying, didn't you know this was bad? Why would you think that FTT, which couldn't be sold because it's FTX's token that no one essentially wanted to buy in bad times, you knew you couldn't sell that off for $3 billion. Why would you have that on your balance sheet for $3 billion when you know you can't sell it and it's not worth that? And there's a lot of questions that I think, again, this all comes down to criminal intent. And it all comes down to what Sam knew and when, and that's something that we've been covering for weeks here on Coinage. And again, if I were to guess here, I would say, as we've scored this throughout, the defense did too little too late to really move the needle in maybe swaying the jury's ideas of Sam. And certainly, I think they're really leaning on the idea of maybe one juror getting stuck in that deliberation room saying, I'm not sure, I'm not convinced it was criminal intent throughout this whole quote-unquote scheme. At the same time, I think we're going to see how long it takes for them to deliberate. If it's a quick thing, I think that bodes terribly for Sam, because the whole government's idea is, look, this is simple fraud. We'll walk through 6 different examples of where fraud was definitely committed, and you can see that here. And at least you believe that, like, if they spend no time, Sam's going to jail for sure. Which, of course, you probably could have thought going into this trial. But if they take longer, maybe you start to think about what's going on in that deliberation room. What does the jury really believe when they're weighing what the prosecution said in their closing arguments about this being, simple, and the defense in this being, look, people made some mistakes, but it's not criminal. And we'll see what happens. But that's the latest from the courtroom. That is how this whole trial, after 4 weeks, speedy, might I add, resulted in the facts in front of the jury. There was a lot that I think Sam's team wanted to include when it comes to what lawyers told him was okay. Judge Kaplan kept that out. There were some book excerpts from Michael Lewis's book that they wanted to include. Judge Kaplan kept that out. You know, they were really hindered in what they could actually present to the jury relative to the original defense that we highlighted at Coinage. So it wasn't exactly the case that they had the freedom to do whatever they wanted, but I think that that's part of the process. That's how trials work. That is the difference, I think, between what SBF was able to do in this up until it went down. He was able to say whatever he wanted to say in the media without the power of being under oath. And I think that in the end, it's very different than what happened in public. And we'll see how the jury rules. And of course, we'll bring that to you as we always do here on Coinage. I'm Zack Guzman. That's the latest from the SBF trial. We'll be back with you later on. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you soon.